The papers came on a Tuesday. Miriam Calloway remembered that detail with unusual precision, not the date, not the season, though it was late October and the maples had already surrendered their color, but the day. Tuesday. The most unremarkable day of the week. The kind of day nothing important was supposed to happen on. She'd been making oatmeal when Gerald set the envelope on the counter beside the stove. He didn't say anything immediately. He poured himself coffee, stood by the window for a moment looking out at the yard they'd maintained together for 31 years, and then he said, quietly. The way a person says something they've rehearsed, I think you should read that. She turned down the burner. She picked up the envelope. Her hands were steady, she would think about that later, how steady her hands had been, and she read everything carefully, the way she always read things, from the top of the page to the bottom. Without skipping ahead. It was a dissolution of marriage filing. Gerald had already signed his section. She set it back on the counter beside the oatmeal that was beginning to stick to the bottom of the pot, and she looked at her husband of 31 years, and she said, all right. Just that. All right. Because what else do you say at 58, when the version of your life you believed in, the one you've been living, carefully, faithfully, in good faith, quietly closes its door? She didn't know yet what she was walking toward. She only knew that somewhere behind her, things were ending. And somewhere further back, much further back, something had been waiting. The house went to Gerald. That was in the agreement, and Miriam's attorney had circled it in red pen with a face that suggested outrage on her behalf, but Miriam had not felt outraged. She had felt, strangely, unburdened. It was a large house, 4 bedrooms, a finished basement, a backyard that had required a riding mower Gerald insisted on buying despite the fact that Miriam was the one who always operated it. They'd raised 2 children in that house. Their son, David, lived in Portland now and called on the first Sunday of every month with the kind of practiced regularity that suggested obligation more than desire. Their daughter, Penny, lived 40 minutes away and visited in the way adult children visit when they are worried about a parent but unsure how to say so, frequent, slightly hovering. Bringing casseroles. Miriam had never been the kind of woman to mistake a house for a home. She understood that distinction early, though she'd forgotten it somewhere in the middle of her marriage, the way a person forgets a skill they stop practicing. What she received in the settlement was modest, some savings, her car, a 2011 Honda that ran fine but needed new wiper blades, and the deed to a property outside Dellard, Tennessee. A small piece of land that had belonged to her father, Earl Hadley, and that had sat idle for more than 20 years following his death. Her attorney had looked at the deed with mild confusion. Do you know what's on this property? A gas station, Miriam said. Or what used to be one. And you want to keep it? Yes. She drove out to see it on a Saturday in November, 3 weeks after signing the papers. The road to Dellard was one she hadn't traveled in years. It passed through a stretch of Tennessee countryside that had changed remarkably little, the same cattle fields, the same low hills. The same gas station on the county line that had been a gas station since before she was born, now advertising lottery tickets and energy drinks instead of the things it once advertised. But still standing, still open. Her father's station was 5 miles further down Route 9. She almost drove past it. The sign, Hadley's Service and Fuel, had lost 2 of its letters, so it read H. Glaze S. Revice and Fuel, and the remaining letters had faded from red to a pale, washed-out pink that looked somehow dignified, like an old woman's lipstick worn to its last layer. The canopy over the pumps had a section of aluminum missing on the right side, curled back like a page corner. The pumps themselves were ancient, the kind with mechanical dials, not digital screens. One had a piece of twine wrapped around its handle for reasons she couldn't immediately identify. But the building was still there. The glass in the windows was intact. The door, when she tried it, was locked, and when she used the key from the deed packet, a small brass key she'd been carrying in her coat pocket for 3 weeks. Turning it over with her thumb without realizing she was doing it, the door opened. Inside, it smelled of old oil and something faintly sweet. Dust lay on everything evenly, like snow that had fallen undisturbed. A counter ran along the right wall. Behind it, shelves. A small back office with a metal desk. Miriam stood in the center of the room for a long time. She was 58 years old. She had a Honda with bad wipers, a modest savings account, and a daughter who brought casseroles out of concern. And she had this. She wasn't sure yet what this was. But she walked to the window and looked out at the old pumps, and the familiar stretch of Route 9 beyond them, and she thought of her father, his hands, his particular quietness. The way he'd always seemed most himself when he was working, and something loosened in her chest. Not grief. Not exactly. Something older than grief. Something that had been sealed up for a long time, and was only now beginning to breathe. Earl Hadley had opened the station in 1971, the year before Miriam was born. She knew the story the way people know family stories, in broad strokes, a few vivid details, the gaps filled in with imagination. He'd come back from Vietnam with both legs and neither certainty nor direction, which was a common enough condition for men returning from that particular war. And he'd bought the land on Route 9 with money he'd saved over 14 months of overseas pay that he'd had no opportunity to spend. He'd built the station himself, with help from two brothers and a neighbor named Chet who apparently owed Earl a significant favor no one had ever explained to Miriam's satisfaction. He'd run it until 1999. 28 years. When Miriam was a child, the station had been as natural a part of her landscape as the kitchen table or the school bus. She went there after school on Fridays. She did homework on the counter while her father worked. She learned to pump gas at 10, because Earl believed in practical knowledge and had no patience for the idea that girls shouldn't understand mechanical things. She knew the sound of every customer's car by the time she was 12. She knew which regulars took their coffee with 2 sugars and which ones didn't want to be talked to and which ones would stay for an hour if you let them. The station had been a kind of living room for Route 9. That was how she thought of it now, standing in it again, dusting off the counter with an old rag she'd found in the supply closet, still stocked with rags, she noticed. Still folded in the particular way her father had always folded them, edge to edge twice, then thirds. She stood holding the rag for a moment, looking at the fold. He'd been dead 23 years. And his folded rags were still here. She began coming out every day. She didn't have a plan, not initially. She came because she needed somewhere to be that wasn't Penny's couch, where she'd been sleeping since the house transfer. And because the station required the kind of work that used her body, clearing, cleaning, assessing, which was the only kind of work that helped her think clearly. She made lists. She took photographs. She called the county office to understand the permits required to reopen a fuel dispensing facility after an extended dormancy period. And she learned that the answer was many permits and considerable inspection, which she had anticipated. She found a contractor named Walt Briggs in Dellard who came out on a Tuesday, the same unremarkable day, and walked the property with the steady, unhurried manner of a man who had looked at a great many deteriorated things in his life and had learned not to catastrophize them. "It's not as bad as it looks," he said. "How bad does it look?" she asked. He scratched the back of his neck. "Moderate." She liked Walt. He spoke in precise understatements, which she found restful. Over the following weeks, she developed a routine. She arrived at the station at 8. She worked until noon. She ate lunch at the counter, sitting on the stool her father had always kept behind the register. She'd found it in the back office, turned on its side. And had carried it out herself, and she looked out the window at Route 9 and ate her sandwich and thought. She didn't think about Gerald, particularly. She thought about what surprised her, which was that she didn't miss the life she'd lost as much as she'd expected to. She missed certain mornings. She missed a version of Gerald that had existed earlier, a younger man who had laughed more easily. She missed the shape of a shared life, the comfort of its predictability. But she did not miss feeling like a guest in her own days. What she felt in the station, even in its broken, dusty state, was something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt located. As though she knew exactly where she was. It was Penny who suggested she go through the old filing cabinet. Penny had come out one Saturday in January, bringing coffee and the barely concealed concern she always carried, and she'd walked the property with her mother. Asking careful questions and making small encouraging noises. At the filing cabinet in the back office, a 4-drawer steel cabinet, pale green, the kind made in the 1960s that weighed approximately as much as a small car, she'd paused and said. "Have you looked in here yet?" "I've been working around it," Miriam admitted. "Mom. I know." She knew. She'd been aware of the filing cabinet since the first day. She'd cleaned around it. She'd swept behind it, which required moving it 6 inches to the left, which she'd done with considerable effort and without looking at it directly. She had been, without fully acknowledging it to herself, reluctant to open it. There was something in that reluctance she only partially understood. The rags folded in her father's way had undone her quietly, standing at the supply closet. She wasn't sure what the cabinet might do. After Penny left, Miriam stood in front of it for a while. The winter light came through the small window above the desk, the window that looked out at nothing interesting, just the back property, a rusted fence. A stand of bare sycamores, and fell in a flat, honest way across the cabinet. She opened the bottom drawer first. Tax records. Fuel delivery invoices. Vehicle service records dating back to 1974, organized in hanging folders in her father's careful handwriting, each folder labeled, each paper filed chronologically. The precision of it moved her. Her father had been a quiet man, sometimes too quiet, the kind of quiet that came from keeping things orderly because orderliness was one of the only things that could be fully controlled. She understood that quality in him now better than she had as a child, now that she had lived long enough to understand why a person might need something they could fully control. The third drawer held parts catalogs, equipment manuals. A folder marked personnel that contained only 2 files, herself and a teenage boy named Raymond who had apparently worked summers from 1987 to 1989. The top drawer was the one she'd been avoiding. She opened it. On the left side, neatly organized, correspondence. Supplier letters. A folder from the county assessor's office. Utility bills going back to 1985. On the right side, one thing. A metal lockbox, small, the kind sold at hardware stores for keeping cash or documents secure. It had a combination lock. It sat at the back of the drawer with a folded piece of paper taped to its top. Miriam stood very still. The paper had her name on it. Written in her father's handwriting. Miriam. Just that. In blue ink. The letters careful and slightly formal, the way he wrote when he was being deliberate about something. She stood there for a long time, longer than was perhaps rational, with her hand resting on top of the lockbox but not lifting it. Outside, the sycamores made a small sound in the wind. A car passed on Route 9. She thought, he knew I would be the one to find this. He had died in 2001. Gerald and Miriam had still been, she calculated, 21 years from the end of their marriage. Her father had been 71, and had been in declining health since a stroke in 1998, and had never, in any conversation Miriam could remember, suggested that there was anything in the station worth finding. He had kept this for her, somehow, across 23 years. She picked up the lockbox. It was heavier than she expected. The combination took her 2 weeks to find. This was not, she reflected later, due to any failure of intelligence. It was due to something more complicated, a mix of reverence and dread, the particular feeling of standing at the edge of information that will change how you understand your past. She was in no hurry, in the end, to arrive there. She tried the obvious things first, her birthday, the year the station opened, the year of her father's birth. None worked. She tried her mother's birthday. She tried the address of the house she'd grown up in. She tried combinations that held no logic at all, because sometimes that's what a person does when they're stalling. The answer came to her on a Wednesday morning while she was on her knees repainting the baseboard behind the counter, work she'd invented. Unnecessary work she was doing because the contractor wasn't coming until Thursday and she needed her hands to be busy. She thought about the number her father used for everything. Not a date. Not an address. His military service number. He'd mentioned it once, only once, that she could recall, when she was perhaps 14, and she'd asked him why he kept a particular card in his wallet that had nothing but numbers on it. He'd shown her. Old habit, he'd said. Some things you just keep. She'd written the number in her phone's note app when she'd thought of it, uncertain she'd remembered it correctly. She drove to the station that afternoon without stopping home first. 6 digits. The lock opened on the first try. Inside the lockbox, a folded document, a smaller envelope, and a passbook from a savings institution in Delard, First Regional Savings, which had been acquired and reacquired so many times over the decades that it no longer existed under that name. She opened the passbook first. It was a savings account opened in 1991 in the name of Miriam and Hadley Calloway. Her maiden and married names together, he'd known she was Calloway by then. She and Gerald had married in 1989. The account had been opened with an initial deposit of $3,000. And then, entries. Regular deposits, handwritten in the bank's ledger style, every 3 months without exception, from 1991 through 1999 when the station closed. Every quarter, $300. Sometimes $250 in the harder quarters, but never missed entirely. She counted the entries. 32 deposits over 8 years. At the last entry, 1999, the balance was listed as a number she had to read twice. Then she opened the document. It was a letter, handwritten on the back of a piece of station letterhead, the old Hadley's service and fuel letterhead, with the logo she remembered. The small stylized flame beside the H, and it began simply, the way her father began most things, Miriam. I've been putting this money by since '91. Started when the hard years hit and I thought about what I wished someone had put by for me. I don't know when you'll find this or what your life will look like then. I hope it looks good. If it doesn't, I hope this helps it look better. The station is yours when I'm gone. The combination is the only number I ever kept. I figured you'd remember. I know I wasn't always easy to talk to. I want you to know it wasn't that I didn't have things to say. It was that I didn't always know how to say them without taking up too much room. Your mother used to tell me I took up too much room when I talked about things that mattered. Maybe she was right. So I saved it up. I put it in a box. That's the kind of man I am. The station was the best thing I ever built. Not because it made money, it didn't, not always, but because I knew what I was doing there. Every day I knew what I was doing. I think you're the same kind of person. I think you'll know what to do with this. Your father, Earl. Miriam sat on the floor of the back office for a long time. She didn't cry immediately. She held the letter and the passbook and the small envelope, which contained, she would discover later, a second key and a folded piece of paper with the name of the account's successor institution, and she sat with the weight of what her father had done. He had saved money for her, quietly, for 8 years. He had never told her. He had died without telling her. He had trusted, somehow, that she would end up here. He had built a door and left it closed, because he understood that she wasn't ready for it yet. That life would bring her to it when she needed it. He had waited, even past his own death, with the patience of a man who knew that some things take a long time to become necessary. She reopened the station the first Saturday of June. It wasn't a grand reopening. She hadn't advertised extensively, a notice in the Delard weekly paper, a hand-painted sign Walt Briggs helped her install on Route 9 3 days before. And a Facebook page that Penny had created and managed because Miriam found the platform bewildering and slightly exhausting. The page had 400 followers by opening day, which Penny insisted was remarkable for Delard, Tennessee. She'd used the account her father had built to cover the majority of the renovation costs. She'd used her own savings for the rest. The new pumps were modern, but she'd kept the mechanical design of the original canopy, repaired rather than replaced. The sign now read Hadley's Service and Fuel in full, the letters read again, the same red she remembered from childhood. Which she'd achieved by bringing an old photograph to the sign painter and asking him to match it as closely as possible. He'd looked at the photograph for a while and said, "That's a particular red." And she'd said, "I know. That's why." The inside had been cleaned and repainted and stocked. The counter was the same counter. She'd refinished it herself, taking 3 weekends to strip and rest on it, and it had emerged looking not new but properly old. The way a restored thing looks when you've respected what it originally was. The stool was behind the register. She'd framed one thing and hung it above the door, the station letterhead from her father's letter. Not the letter itself, that stayed private, but a clean piece of the original letterhead she'd found in the office, the Hadley's Service and Fuel logo with the small stylized flame. Just that. Opening day was warm and hazy, the particular quality of Tennessee summer arriving early, the air soft with it. She unlocked the door at 7 in the morning before any customers arrived and stood at the counter for a moment in the quiet. The light came through the restored windows and fell the way it always had, she thought, or the way she imagined it had. She'd been small the last time she stood here in the morning. And memory adjusts things over decades, softens and shifts them, so that what you remember is less a photograph than a feeling. The first customer was a man she didn't recognize who stopped for fuel and bought a coffee and said, "Good to see this place open again." She said, "Thank you." He said, "My dad used to stop here." Hadley's. She looked at him. He was probably 60, gray at the temples, the kind of face that had weathered well. "Earl Hadley was my father," she said. The man stood still for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, with the particular gravity of someone receiving information that means more than it appears to. "Your dad fixed my dad's truck once," he said. 1987 or so. Wouldn't take payment. My dad talked about that for years. She didn't know what to say, so she just said, "That sounds like him." He paid for his coffee and drove away. And she stood at the window watching the car disappear down Route 9. By noon, she'd had 43 customers. By 3 in the afternoon, she'd had over 100. Penny had come by at 10 and stayed, sitting on the second stool they'd retrieved from the back office. Watching her mother work with an expression Miriam couldn't fully read, something between pride and discovery. As though she were seeing her mother for the first time as a person who had existed before the version Penny had known. David had called. He hadn't come, but he'd called, and his voice had contained something genuine in it, surprise, she thought, and something that might have been admiration trying to find its footing. Gerald had not called. She hadn't expected him to. She found she felt almost nothing about that, not bitterness, not satisfaction, but a kind of neutral acknowledgement. He had been part of her life, and now he wasn't, and the station had been waiting long before he was ever in it. Near closing time, when the cars had thinned to occasional, she sat on her father's stool and looked out at Route 9 in the late afternoon light. The sycamores on the back property had leafed out fully by now, and their branches were visible above the roofline from where she sat, moving lightly. She thought about her father writing that letter. Sitting at his metal desk in the back office, writing on the letterhead with the careful formality he applied to things that mattered. "That's the kind of man I am." She could hear him saying it. That flat, honest, slightly defensive self-description of a man who was sorry he couldn't be more fluent in tenderness and was doing what he could with what he had. She had thought, for most of her adult life, that her father had been somewhat remote. She had loved him without question, but she had understood him, she believed she'd understood him, as a man who kept his interior life at some distance from the people around him. A good man, but sealed. She understood now that she'd been wrong. He hadn't been sealed. He'd been saving. 3 months after reopening, she hired a young woman named Tasha, 19, local. Studying accounting at the community college in Delard, who came in mornings before class and proved to be exactly the kind of efficient, self-directed person who required almost no management. Which was the only kind of person Miriam was interested in employing. She hired Walt Briggs's nephew, Marcus, to help with the mechanical side. The station had added a small service component, just oil changes and basic repairs. Which required more expertise than Miriam possessed, though she was acquiring it steadily in the way she acquired most things, through attentiveness and repetition. The station had not become profitable in the dramatic sense. It covered its costs. It covered her costs, modestly. She lived in a small house in Delard she rented month to month, and her expenses were modest. And she had realized somewhere in the process that modest was not a diminishment but a clarity, that knowing exactly what you needed and having enough of it was a kind of wealth she hadn't recognized. In the years she'd spent in the large house with the riding mower. What surprised her most, what continued to surprise her, months in, was the station's effect on the people who came to it. She hadn't anticipated this. She'd thought of it as a business, a practical matter. She'd thought of it as her father's legacy and perhaps her own livelihood. She hadn't thought of it as a place. But it was a place. It had always been a place. And people, it turned out, still needed those. They stopped for gas and stayed for 15 minutes. They came in for coffee and told her things, not because she asked, but because there was something in the station's particular atmosphere. The old counter and the light through the windows and the unhurried quality of the woman behind the register, that made the interior of a life feel speakable. A man told her his wife had just been diagnosed with something serious. A woman stopped in on the way home from dropping her youngest at college, still holding herself very carefully together. And Miriam had given her a cup of coffee and sat beside her on the second stool and said nothing at all for several minutes, because sometimes nothing is the right thing. A teenager had come in 3 times in 1 week, buying small things, gum, a bottle of water, a pack of batteries, before finally sitting at the counter on the 3rd visit and saying, in the halting way of someone who has worked up to something, "My parents are splitting up." Miriam had nodded. "That's hard," she'd said. And then, after a moment, "You're going to be okay." The kid had looked at her with the slightly suspicious expression of a teenager being offered comfort by an adult. "How do you know?" "Because you keep coming back," she'd said. "People who come back are usually going to be okay." She thought about that exchange later, sitting at the close of the day with the station quiet around her. She thought about the strange truth of it, that the station had been her own coming back, her return to something she hadn't known she needed to return to. She had lost a house and found a place. She had lost a marriage and found, not a replacement, but something more durable, herself, located. She thought about her father's letter often. She'd read it so many times now that she no longer needed to take it out to recall it word for word. She turned it over in her mind the way she turned the brass key over in her coat pocket, and each time she arrived at the same set of sentences, "I wasn't always easy to talk to. I want you to know it wasn't that I didn't have things to say." She had gone back to her memory of her father with those sentences and looked at everything differently. The quietness that she'd sometimes experienced as distance, she saw it now as a particular form of attention. He had watched, and he had thought, and he had saved. He had made the station and let her learn it. He had put money by for a daughter who didn't yet need it. He had written a letter and locked it in a box with a number only she would remember, and then he had died and trusted. That was the word that kept returning to her. Trusted. He had trusted that life would bring her to the place where she needed what he'd left. He had trusted her to find the combination. He had trusted, perhaps most remarkably, that she would not arrive at 58 and find herself unable to begin again. He had known her better than she had known herself. Or perhaps more precisely, he had known something about her that she hadn't yet had occasion to need, and he had simply held it for her, in a small metal box with a lock, until she was ready. On a warm evening in September, she sat on the front step of the station after closing and watched Route 9 in the last light. The hills behind the tree line were doing what Tennessee hills do in September, going golden at the edges, the light thickening toward amber as it dropped. A few cars passed. The sign, Hadley's Service and Fuel, read, the flame beside the H, caught the light briefly and held it. She thought about the Tuesday the papers came. She thought about Gerald's face at the window, looking at the yard he was keeping. She thought about her own hands on the envelope, how steady they'd been, how strange that steadiness had seemed at the time and how unsurprising it seemed now. She had been steady because something in her, deeper than the marriage, deeper than the house and the routine and the 31 years of shared life, had already known what she needed. It had been patient, that knowledge. Patient the way her father was patient. Patient the way certain kinds of love are patient, not urgent, not loud, but extraordinarily durable. She stayed until the light was fully gone and the first stars appeared, faint and unconcerned, above the tree line. Then she went inside, locked the door with the small brass key, and drove home on Route 9 the way she had driven it 1,000 times, as a child in her father's truck. As a young woman coming home for visits, as someone in the middle of a marriage, and now as this particular woman, at this particular moment in her life. Going home to a small rented house in Dellard, Tennessee, with enough. There is a kind of love that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive at important moments with the weight and ceremony we expect of love. It doesn't explain itself or ask to be recognized. It simply works, quietly, consistently, in small increments, and it puts things in boxes and locks them, and it trusts that the person it loves will find them when the time comes. Earl Hadley had never been able to tell his daughter what she meant to him in the way she might have wished for, in the fluent language of expressed feeling. He was a man formed by things that made fluency difficult, a war, a particular silence, a generation's habit of keeping the interior life private. But he had not been absent. He had been present in a different register, one she'd needed most of her life to learn to read. The station was still open. On most mornings, if you drove Route 9 outside Dellard and stopped at Hadley's Service and Fuel, you'd find a woman in her early 60s behind the counter, quiet but not unfriendly. With the particular attentiveness of someone who has learned to pay attention to the things in front of her. She makes good coffee. She doesn't rush you. Above the door there's a piece of old letterhead in a simple frame, a logo, a small flame, a name. She didn't lose everything when she was 58. She found out what she already had. And perhaps that is the question worth sitting with. Not what do we lose as the years pass and the lives we'd planned for quietly close their doors, but what has been kept for us, folded carefully. Locked safely, waiting with a patience we didn't know to be grateful for until the day we finally needed the key. Some love doesn't speak. It saves.